His German shepherd refused to leave the roaring waterfall, until one strange sound made the veteran step behind the rushing water. The roar of the falls swallowed every other sound as the old German shepherd froze, ears locked forward. His muddy paws scraped at the slick rock while cold mist soaked the veteran's face. Then a hollow knock echoed beneath the crashing water. He took one cautious step forward and saw something that shouldn't have been there. "Where are you watching from today?" The thunder cracked so sharply that Jack Sullivan came awake with both hands already moving. His right hand reached toward the empty space beside his bedroll before his mind caught up with his body. There was no rifle leaning against a bunker wall, no helmet hanging from a sandbag, no radio hissing with broken voices. Only the inside of an aging blue pickup truck parked beneath towering pines somewhere along the Bitter Ridge Highway. His breathing stayed shallow. Outside, rain hammered the windshield. Another flash lit the mountains. For a single heartbeat, the white light became the flare of an exploding mortar round, and Jack's muscles locked exactly as they had 20 years earlier on a rocky hillside outside Kandahar. A warm weight pressed gently against his forearm. Atlas. The German shepherd rested his scarred muzzle on Jack's sleeve without making a sound. The old dog had learned long ago that silence worked better than barking. Jack slowly unclenched his fist. The shaking in his fingers eased. "False alarm," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Atlas or himself. The dog lifted his head only after Jack's breathing settled into something close to normal. Rain continued drumming against the truck roof. Jack glanced toward the dashboard clock. 18 a.m. He hadn't slept more than 2 straight hours in months. Some nights it was thunder, other nights a passing helicopter, sometimes nothing at all. His body simply decided it was back inside an active combat zone before his mind could argue otherwise. He rubbed both hands across his weathered face and stared through the rain-covered windshield. The mountains disappeared into darkness beyond the trees. Beautiful country, quiet country. Yet every loud echo rolling through those valleys carried memories he never invited back. Atlas stretched stiffly before climbing into the passenger seat to watch the road as though he were still assigned perimeter security. The dog's left ear carried a permanent notch from an explosion years ago. Silver fur had begun creeping across his muzzle. Arthritis slowed him during cold mornings, but his eyes remained exactly the same. Always watching, always working. Jack smiled faintly. "You never really retired either, did you?" Atlas answered with one slow sweep of his tail against the seat. Morning arrived behind heavy clouds. Jack folded his blanket with practiced precision before storing it behind the driver's seat. Old habits survived everything. Every item had its place. Backpack, flashlight, camp stove, medical kit, water containers. Nothing moved unless it had to. He checked the truck the same way he had once checked vehicles before patrols: fuel.oil, tire pressure, escape routes, observation. Routine kept the bad days manageable. Breakfast consisted of instant coffee heated over a small burner and half a package of crackers shared equally with Atlas. The dog never begged. He simply waited. Discipline survived retirement too. By late morning, Jack rolled into the tiny mountain town of Pine Crossing. It was little more than a gas station, a grocery store, 2 churches, and a post office squeezed between endless forests and granite ridges. The post office clerk recognized him before he reached the counter. "Morning, Jack," he nodded politely. "Morning. You've got certified mail." She disappeared into the back room before returning with a thick cream-colored envelope. The return address caught his attention immediately. Ellis and Harper Attorneys at Law, Ashford County. He frowned. "I don't know anyone over there." The clerk shrugged. "They seem determined to find you." Jack signed for the envelope and stepped back outside. Atlas waited patiently beside the truck, sitting exactly where Jack had told him. A little girl walking with her grandmother stopped several yards away. "Can I pet him?" Jack looked toward Atlas. "Stay." The shepherd remained motionless. "Go ahead." The girl carefully scratched behind Atlas's ears. He looks like a wolf. Sometimes he thinks he is. The child laughed. It was the first genuine smile Jack had seen all morning. After they walked away, he climbed into the truck and carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested a formal letter, several legal documents, and one folded map. His eyes moved slowly across the first paragraph. Dear Mr. Jack Sullivan, you are hereby requested to appear regarding the final estate of Mr. Owen Mercer. Jack stopped reading. His chest tightened. Owen. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in nearly 15 years. Master Sergeant Owen Mercer. Special Forces Reconnaissance. Quiet, patient. Always carrying twice the equipment anyone else packed. The man who could navigate an entire mountain range using stars hidden behind cloud cover. The man Jack had once dragged 50 yards under enemy fire after an ambush shattered their patrol. The memory arrived without warning. Dust, gunfire, the smell of burning diesel. Owen shouting something through the smoke. Then silence. Jack closed his eyes until the memory faded. He forced himself back to the letter. Mr. Mercer named you sole beneficiary of a parcel of privately held land located within Bitter Ridge National Forest boundary. He blinked. The next sentence confused him even more. Property description: Callahan Falls and surrounding cliff parcel, no residence, no structures listed. Jack unfolded the accompanying survey map. A blue line curved through rugged mountains before ending at a waterfall marked with faded ink. That was it. No house, no ranch, no cabin, just water. Atlas leaned forward, placing both front paws on the seat. His nose touched the old survey map. Then the dog became strangely still. His ears lifted, not toward the road, not toward passing cars, toward the mountains printed across the paper. Jack watched him for several seconds. What is it? Atlas sniffed the map again before quietly sitting back down, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the windshield, as if the old dog recognized a place he had never seen. Jack looked once more at the letter. The final sentence lingered in his thoughts long after he folded the papers away. Mr. Mercer believed you would understand why this land mattered. Jack stared through the windshield toward the distant mountain ridges disappearing beneath gathering storm clouds. A waterfall? He murmured. Why would Owen leave me a waterfall? Atlas never took his eyes off the mountains. Jack folded the letter with the same care he once used for classified maps and slid it back into the envelope. The old dog remained unusually still, his ears angled forward as if listening to something only he could hear. Finally, Jack started the truck and pointed it toward Bitter Ridge. The drive took nearly 5 hours. The farther he climbed, the narrower the roads became. Asphalt gave way to patched gravel, and the towns shrank into scattered cabins tucked beneath towering pines. Rusted fences leaned against open meadows where cattle grazed beneath snow-dusted peaks. Every bend revealed another stretch of wilderness that seemed untouched by time. Atlas stayed alert in the passenger seat. He never slept. His eyes followed every ridgeline. Jack noticed. Military dogs didn't waste attention. Neither had Atlas. Ashford County sat in a broad valley surrounded by granite cliffs. Its courthouse looked older than most of the trucks parked outside, built from weathered stone that had survived generations of mountain winters. Inside, everything smelled faintly of pine wood and old paper. A woman with silver hair looked up from behind a polished oak desk. "You must be Mr. Sullivan." Jack removed his cap. "Margaret Ellis?" She smiled warmly. "I've been hoping you'd come." Her office overlooked the valley. Framed survey maps covered one wall while thick legal volumes lined another. A long wooden table already held several folders waiting for him. She gestured toward a chair. "I knew Owen for almost 30 years, Jack sat quietly. "I didn't know he'd settled here." "He never really settled anywhere," Margaret replied. "But these mountains became the closest thing he ever called home." She opened the first folder. "Owen Mercer passed away peacefully 6 weeks ago." Jack lowered his eyes. Another teammate gone. There were fewer names left every year. He left very clear instructions. Margaret slid several documents across the table. Everything else in his estate was donated exactly as requested. Jack scanned the paperwork. One pickup, personal savings, military medals, old equipment. Most of it had gone to veterans organizations. Only one item carried his name, Callahan Falls. Margaret noticed his expression. I imagine this wasn't what you expected. I wasn't expecting anything. She nodded. Neither was anyone else. She unfolded a large county survey map across the table. The waterfall occupied a narrow canyon deep inside Bitter Ridge. Nearly 100 acres surrounded it, mostly cliffs, dense forest, rock formations, no marked structures, no utilities, no road access beyond an old logging trail. It isn't farmland, Margaret explained. It can't really be logged because most of it falls under environmental restrictions. No mineral rights, none that we've found. No buildings. She shook her head. Nothing registered. Jack studied the faded contour lines. Something bothered him. The property boundary curved strangely around the canyon, ignoring several easier survey lines, almost as if someone had insisted on including very specific pieces of terrain. His finger traced the northern ridge. Who drew this? The original survey dates back over 40 years. It was revised. Margaret looked surprised. You noticed. The handwriting changes. She leaned closer. It does. And whoever revised it measured around the cliff instead of across it. You've read survey maps before? Jack gave a tired smile. I've read maps that decided whether people came home. Margaret said nothing. For a long moment, she simply watched him. Owen always said you'd notice things other people missed. Before Jack could answer, loud voices drifted in from outside. A heavy-set rancher stepped through the office doorway carrying his hat. Morning, Margaret. His eyes landed on Jack. So that's him, Margaret introduced them. This is Earl Dawson. The rancher extended a rough hand. Heard you're the fellow inherited the falls. Jack shook it. So I've been told, Earl chuckled. Well, he scratched his beard. Ain't much to inherit. Pretty place. Fine fishing downstream. But nobody's ever figured out a useful thing to do with it. Jack merely nodded. Another man appeared behind Earl. Unlike the rancher, this one wore polished boots, an expensive jacket, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Victor Hale. Margaret's expression cooled immediately. Mr. Hale. I heard there was finally a new owner. Victor removed his sunglasses. Congratulations, Mr. Sullivan. Jack remained seated. Victor walked toward the map. I own several thousand acres bordering federal land east of your property. So I'd be willing to save you some trouble. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a business card. I'll offer you $25,000 today. Margaret frowned. Victor, it's generous. He smiled. For rocks, trees, and a noisy waterfall. Jack looked down at the map again. $25,000. A month ago he probably would have accepted without hesitation. Enough to rent an apartment, replace his failing truck, maybe even pay for another round of therapy. Instead, he heard Owen's voice. Slow down. Observe first. Move later. Jack folded the business card once, then handed it back. I haven't even seen the place. Victor shrugged. You won't change your mind. Maybe. You'll find out it's exactly what everyone says. Worthless? Victor smiled wider. Exactly. Jack stood. I'll decide after I look. Victor slipped the card back into his pocket. I'll leave the offer open. As he walked away, Jack noticed expensive hiking boots. Brand new, not a speck of mountain dust. A man who liked owning wilderness more than walking through it. Outside the courthouse, Atlas stood from beside the truck the instant Jack appeared. The shepherd ignored everyone except Jack. Then something changed. Atlas lowered his nose toward the envelope tucked beneath Jack's arm. He sniffed once, twice, his posture stiffened. Without warning, he turned toward the western mountains. His entire body froze. Jack followed the direction of the dog's stare. Far beyond the valley, one narrow ribbon of white cut through the dark evergreen forest. The waterfall. Even from miles away, it caught the afternoon sunlight like polished silver. Atlas gave one low whine, not nervous, not afraid, expectant. Jack rested a hand against the old shepherd's neck. "All right, partner." He looked once more toward the distant canyon Owen had chosen over every other place on Earth. "Let's go see what was worth leaving behind." The logging road disappeared sooner than the county map suggested. After 12 rough miles, the truck crawled over exposed roots and loose stone before finally reaching a rusted Forest Service gate hanging crooked on broken hinges. Beyond it, the road narrowed into little more than 2 faded tire tracks swallowed by waist-high grass. Jack shut off the engine. Silence settled over the mountains. Atlas climbed out first. The old shepherd paused beside the truck, lifting his nose into the cool afternoon breeze. His ears rotated slowly, collecting sounds Jack hadn't noticed yet. Jack watched him before looking at the canyon. "Anything out there?" Atlas remained perfectly still. Then he walked forward, not hurried. Purposeful. Jack shouldered his backpack and locked the truck. He carried only what he considered essential: water, medical kit, rope, hatchet, compass, rain gear. Old habits refused unnecessary weight. The trail wound downhill beneath towering Douglas firs where shafts of sunlight slipped through branches thick with moss. Every few hundred yards, Jack stopped without thinking. He scanned. High ground, low ground, possible cover, movement, escape routes. Years had passed since Afghanistan, yet his body still cleared unfamiliar terrain exactly the same way. Atlas waited patiently every time Jack stopped, never pulling ahead until Jack gave a quiet nod. Late afternoon brought the first sound, a distant roar, soft at first, like wind, then stronger, steady, relentless, water. Jack froze. The sound shifted in his ears. For one impossible second, it became helicopter rotors chopping across a desert valley. Dust filled his memory. The air smelled suddenly of burned fuel instead of pine. Someone yelled for a medic. Another voice shouted coordinates, LZ secured. Jack's breathing quickened, his vision narrowed. Atlas immediately turned around. Without barking, the shepherd walked straight back and pressed firmly against Jack's left side. Solid, warm, real. Jack blinked twice. The helicopters vanished. Only the waterfall remained. He rested one hand against Atlas's shoulder. "I'm here," the words came out barely above a whisper. "So are you." The dog leaned against him another moment, before quietly continuing down the trail. Near sunset, they reached the canyon overlook. Jack stopped. Callahan Falls dropped more than 100 feet through black granite before exploding into white spray below. Mist drifted upward in shimmering waves that caught the fading sunlight like smoke made of gold. It was beautiful, wild, completely isolated. No cabins, no fences, no roads, just cliffs, forest, and the endless roar of falling water. So this is it. Atlas ignored the view. Instead, he began studying the ground. His nose moved from one patch of earth to another before he wandered toward the northern side of the overlook. Jack noticed the dog wasn't exploring randomly, he was following scent. Jack chose a campsite on slightly elevated ground beneath several massive pines nearly 200 yards from the falls, far enough to avoid flooding, close enough to observe the canyon. He smiled faintly. Without realizing it, he'd selected a defensive position. Hold instincts. He built a simple lean-to using a weatherproof tarp stretched between 2 trees. Fallen branches became a windbreak. Rainwater collected cleanly from one corner into metal containers. By dark, a small cooking fire flickered behind a ring of carefully placed stones. Atlas completed one slow circle around camp before lying where he could watch both the trail and Jack at the same time. Dinner consisted of canned stew warmed over the fire. Atlas received half. Jack never ate before the dog, another habit carried home from deployment. The mountain grew darker. Only the waterfall continued speaking, hour after hour. Its constant roar filled every empty space. Jack wrapped himself inside his blanket. Sleep came slowly, somewhere after midnight. Crack! A dead pine split in the distance. Jack was already moving before he understood why. He rolled away from the fire, grabbed the flashlight, and dropped into one knee behind a fallen log. His pulse hammered, eyes searching, breathing controlled. Contact left, contact right, nothing, only darkness. Then Atlas walked calmly toward him, carrying the blanket Jack had accidentally dragged halfway across camp. The shepherd dropped it beside him. Jack stared at the dog, then laughed quietly. "I guess we're not in the Korengal anymore." Atlas wagged his tail once. The tension slowly left Jack's shoulders. Morning arrived beneath drifting fog. After coffee, Jack began walking the property. He carried a small notebook instead of relying on memory. Distance from camp, water sources, animal tracks, possible shelters, natural choke points. The habit reminded him of patrol debriefings. Observe, record, never assume. Around noon he heard footsteps approaching from the trail. Atlas stood immediately. No growling, only alert. An elderly woman emerged carrying 2 canvas bags over one shoulder. She couldn't have been much over 5 feet tall, but she climbed the rocky trail without complaint. Her gray hair disappeared beneath a faded blue cap. "You must be Jack," he nodded cautiously. "And you are?" "Ruth Parker." She smiled gently. "I live about 3 miles down the valley." She lifted one bag. "I figured anyone foolish enough to move up here probably forgot fresh bread." Jack almost smiled. "That obvious?" She handed him a wrapped loaf along with a jar of homemade blackberry preserves. "Owen forgot supplies all the time. You knew him. For years." She looked toward the waterfall. "He liked disappearing." Jack glanced at the canyon. "So everyone keeps telling me." Ruth studied him carefully. He wasn't hiding. What was he doing? She took a long moment before answering. "Listening." Jack frowned. "Listening to what?" "The mountain." She smiled as though she knew how strange that sounded. Before Jack could ask another question, Atlas suddenly stood. His ears locked forward. Without hesitation, he trotted toward the northern edge of the canyon. Jack watched him disappear between 2 moss-covered boulders. "Atlas." No response. The dog stopped nearly 50 yards away on a narrow rocky ledge overlooking the waterfall. He stood completely motionless, not sniffing, not searching, simply staring at one specific place beyond the curtain of falling water. Jack followed slowly. When he reached the ledge, Atlas never looked away. Jack searched the cliff. Nothing, only stone, mist, water. Yet the old shepherd remained fixed on that exact spot, as though waiting for something hidden to reveal itself. For the first time, Jack realized Atlas had not been wandering these mountains. He had been returning to the same place, again and again. Jack stood beside Atlas on the narrow ledge, letting the mist settle across his jacket. The waterfall thundered only 50 feet away, pouring over the cliff with enough force to shake the stone beneath his boots. He searched every inch of the rock wall. Nothing. No trail, no opening, only black granite polished smooth by countless years of rushing water. Atlas refused to move. His ears remained forward, his eyes fixed on one section hidden behind the thickest part of the cascade. Jack crouched beside him. "What do you see?" the shepherd answered by placing one paw against the stone. Not scratching, simply touching it. Jack laid his own hand against the rock. Cold, solid, he waited. The roar of the waterfall filled his ears until every other sound disappeared. Then, something else. A faint, hollow vibration, not loud enough to hear clearly, more something felt than heard. He tapped the rock with his knuckles. The sound disappeared beneath the crashing water. He tried again farther to the left. solid granite. Another step, another tap, still solid. Atlas quietly shifted 3 feet to the right. Jack followed. He struck the rock once more. Thunk. Different, barely, but different. His eyes narrowed. He hit it again. Thunk. Not the sharp crack of solid stone, a muted echo, as though empty space waited somewhere beyond. Jack leaned back slowly. Huh. Atlas wagged his tail exactly once. Jack smiled despite himself. You knew. The shepherd blinked. Jack pulled the small notebook from his jacket pocket and sketched the ledge before marking a rough X beside the unusual section of cliff. Never trust memory. Write it down. The habit had saved lives overseas. Maybe it would answer questions here too. The following morning dawned cool and clear. Instead of wandering aimlessly, Jack began treating the inherited land exactly as he once studied unfamiliar operating areas. He divided the canyon into sectors: North Ridge, South Slope, Creek Basin, observation points, possible hazards. Every afternoon, he returned to the same overlook with new notes. Atlas always led the way. Each trip revealed another small detail: an old cedar growing sideways from the cliff, several unusually flat stones arranged almost too neatly to be natural, a narrow animal trail disappearing beneath thick ferns. Nothing remarkable by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. On the 3rd day, Jack climbed farther up the northern ridge, near the edge of a moss-covered shelf. Something caught his eye. Metal. He knelt. Brushing away years of damp moss exposed an iron piton driven deep into the granite. Rust covered its surface, but not enough to hide the deliberate hammer marks. Someone had placed it there. Not recently. Decades ago. Jack looked uphill. 20 feet higher. Another one, almost invisible beneath lichens, then another, a climbing route. His pulse quickened. Military mountaineering equipment. Old, purposefully hidden. He never would have noticed had Atlas not kept returning here. The dog sat patiently nearby, watching him instead of the cliff. Jack looked down the line of pitons. They weren't climbing up. He traced the angle with his finger. They were climbing across. Atlas stood. He walked another few yards before lowering his nose beneath a fallen pine. Jack followed. Half buried beneath needles lay a weathered length of climbing rope. Most of it had rotted away, but one section remained surprisingly intact. Jack turned it over carefully. Professional knots, not random loops. Figure 8 follow-through. Exactly the knot instructors had drilled into soldiers before mountain training. Owen. The realization came quietly. This was yours. That evening, Ruth Parker arrived carrying fresh eggs wrapped inside a towel. She smiled when she saw Jack sitting beside the fire studying his notebook. You've started seeing what he saw. Jack looked up. What do you mean? She poured coffee into an old enamel mug before answering. Owen walked these mountains the same way. He climbed, he observed, he listened. Jack reached into his backpack and handed her the rusted paton. Her eyes widened. I haven't seen one of these in years, so you knew he climbed around the falls. I knew he disappeared there. She handed it back. He never told anyone exactly where. Jack poked at the fire with a stick. Why all the secrecy? Ruth stared toward the distant waterfall. When people think land has no value, they leave it alone. The flames crackled between them. She continued softly. One evening I asked Owen why he spent so much time beside that waterfall. What did he say? He smiled. She laughed quietly at the memory. Then he told me something I never forgot. Jack waited. Ruth's eyes drifted toward Atlas lying beside the fire. He said the mountain only opens for someone who knows how to observe before moving. Silence settled across the campsite. The sentence lingered in Jack's thoughts. Observe before moving, not charge ahead, not force the answer. Study first. Exactly what reconnaissance instructors had repeated through every training exercise. Jack suddenly remembered Afghanistan. A young lieutenant once rushed an unknown ridgeline after spotting movement. Owen had grabbed his shoulder. "Watch first." 30 seconds later, an enemy patrol walked into view. Patience had saved every man on the team. Jack looked toward the waterfall again. Maybe Owen had built this mystery the same way, not hidden, simply overlooked. The next afternoon, clouds drifted across the canyon, softening the sunlight. Jack returned to the ledge. Atlas immediately walked to the same place, again. Always the same place. Jack closed his eyes. Instead of looking, he listened. The waterfall roared endlessly. Yet beneath that enormous sound, the hollow note returned, faint, steady, coming from somewhere behind the falling water. His eyes opened. Then another detail caught his attention. A narrow ribbon of dark green moss climbed diagonally across the cliff face beside the cascade. Unlike every other patch of moss, this strip followed an almost perfectly straight line. Nature rarely worked in straight lines. Jack stepped closer. His fingertips brushed the damp surface. Beneath the moss, stone had been worn smooth, not by water, by countless footsteps. Someone had crossed here, many times. Atlas looked back at him, waiting, as though asking one simple question. Had he finally seen it? Jack rested his hand against the damp cliff and followed the narrow strip of moss with his eyes until it disappeared beneath the pounding curtain of water. The path wasn't obvious. It wasn't meant to be. Whoever had used it understood that the safest trail was the one no one noticed. "Owen," Jack murmured, "you planned every step." Atlas stood beside him, watching the waterfall instead of Jack. The old shepherd's muscles were tight beneath his gray speckled coat. Waiting, not anxious. Ready. The sky darkened before noon. Heavy clouds rolled over Bitter Ridge, swallowing the peaks one after another until only the nearest trees remained visible. The air grew colder, and the wind shifted abruptly down the canyon. Jack looked upward. Storms coming. Atlas turned immediately toward camp. Neither of them hurried. Panic wasted energy. Preparation saved it. Back at camp, Jack moved with quiet efficiency born from decades of repetition. He tightened every guy line supporting the tarp, stacked dry firewood beneath a rock overhang, covered his food supplies with waterproof canvas, checked drainage around the campsite. Every movement reminded him of reinforcing temporary patrol bases before nightfall overseas. The mountain rewarded preparation, so had combat. By late afternoon, the first drops struck the leaves. Within minutes, rain became a solid gray wall. The waterfall swelled visibly. Small streams appeared where dry rock had stood only hours earlier. Jack remained beneath the shelter, sipping coffee while Atlas watched the canyon. Thunder rolled continuously now. Not sharp, deep, the kind that lingered inside the chest. Jack closed his eyes. The sound blended with memories before he could stop them. Rotor blades, heavy transport helicopters approaching, and LZ dust rising. Someone shouting over the headset, 30 seconds! His heartbeat accelerated. His fingers searched instinctively for equipment that wasn't there. Atlas crossed the shelter in 3 quiet steps. The shepherd pressed against Jack's knee, grounding him. Jack focused on the warmth beneath his hand. Not Afghanistan. Bitter Ridge. Rain. Waterfall. Atlas. Slowly the memory dissolved. "Thanks, buddy." Atlas rested his head across Jack's boot. Outside, the storm intensified. Branches whipped violently through the air. Rainwater poured down the cliff in dozens of temporary waterfalls feeding the main cascade. Then something changed. Atlas lifted his head. Every muscle stiffened, his ears locked toward the canyon. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it?" Atlas gave one sharp bark, the first bark Jack had heard since arriving. Without waiting for permission, the shepherd sprinted into the rain. "Atlas!" The dog never looked back. Jack grabbed his rain jacket and flashlight before following. The trail had already become a river of mud. Water rushed around his boots as he fought downhill toward the overlook. Atlas stood near the moss-covered ledge. The waterfall no longer resembled the graceful ribbon Jack had first seen. Now it was a roaring white wall covering nearly the entire cliff face. Mist exploded outward with such force that breathing became difficult. Atlas darted toward the rocks, then vanished. Jack stopped. His pulse jumped. "Atlas!" Only water answered. He climbed carefully across the slick granite. Every surface had become dangerously smooth beneath sheets of rushing rain. He spotted paw prints, fresh, leading directly toward the base of the falls. Jack lowered his center of gravity, moving the way instructors had taught soldiers crossing unstable terrain. 3 points of contact. Test every foothold. Commit only after confirming weight. Halfway across, one boot landed on algae hidden beneath shallow water. The rock disappeared beneath him. His feet shot sideways. Jack slammed violently against the cliff. Pain exploded across his ribs. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. For one terrifying second, he slid toward the churning pool below. His fingers clawed desperately across wet stone. Nothing held. Then teeth closed gently around the sleeve of his jacket. Atlas. The old shepherd braced himself against a narrow crack in the rock. Pulling backward with every ounce of strength left in his aging body, Jack found another handhold, then another. Finally, he dragged himself onto stable ground. He stayed there several seconds, breathing hard. His ribs screamed every time he inhaled. Atlas immediately nudged his face. "I'm okay." The words sounded less convincing than he intended. The dog wasn't satisfied. He tugged lightly at Jack's sleeve, not away from danger, toward the waterfall. Jack forced himself upright. Rain streamed down his face. He followed Atlas across another stretch of rock until they reached the exact place where the shepherd had stood countless times before. Only now, the waterfall had shifted. Floodwater redirected part of the current farther south, exposing a narrow opening behind the cascade that had been completely hidden before. Jack stared. It couldn't have been wider than 3 feet, a strip of dark stone disappearing into the mountain itself. Atlas barked once, then squeezed through the opening. "Atlas!" Jack lunged after him. The instant he stepped behind the waterfall, the world changed. The deafening roar became strangely muffled. A narrow stone ledge stretched along the cliff, protected by the enormous curtain of water only inches away. Cool, dry air drifted from somewhere ahead. Jack raised his flashlight. Its beam reached only a few yards before disappearing into darkness. The ledge continued forward, straight into the mountain. He stood frozen, every instinct sharpened. Unknown terrain, unknown structure, limited visibility. His breathing slowed automatically. "Clear before you move." The old reconnaissance rule echoed through his mind. Ahead, Atlas waited patiently at the mouth of the dark passage. The shepherd didn't appear frightened, only certain. Jack tightened his grip on the flashlight, then took one careful step toward whatever Owen Mercer had hidden for all those years. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow passage carved into solid granite. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, but the floor beneath his boots remained surprisingly dry. Someone had shaped this path by hand. Atlas moved only a few feet ahead, not racing, not exploring, waiting. Every few steps, the old shepherd glanced back to make sure Jack was following. The passage bent gently to the left. Almost immediately, the roar of the waterfall faded until it became little more than a distant rumble. Jack stopped. Silence. Silence. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard it. The quiet felt almost unfamiliar. He swept the flashlight across the walls. Tool marks, old ones, hammer strikes, chisel cuts. Someone had spent months carving this tunnel, maybe years. His fingertips brushed the stone. The edges had softened with age, but the workmanship remained unmistakable. Owen hadn't stumbled across this place. He had built it. The passage widened. A faint draft carried the scent of cedar and old wood instead of damp stone. Jack frowned. Wood. Deep inside a mountain, Alice's ears lifted. He walked forward with renewed purpose before stopping beside what looked like a heavy timber frame built directly into the rock. At first, Jack thought it was another wall. Then he noticed the craftsmanship. The seams matched the surrounding stone almost perfectly. From outside, hidden behind the waterfall, no one would ever suspect a doorway existed. The wooden door stood slightly open. Jack rested one hand against it. The hinges moved without a squeak, maintained. Someone had cared for them for years. He slowly pushed the door inward. Warm amber light from his flashlight spilled across a room that stole the breath from his lungs. It wasn't a cave. It wasn't a storage room. It was a cabin, a real cabin, built inside the mountain itself. Massive cedar beams supported a carefully crafted ceiling. Smooth plank flooring stretched wall to wall. A stone fireplace occupied one corner beside an old cast-iron stove whose chimney disappeared into a narrow crack high above. Shelves lined nearly every wall, not filled with valuables, filled with books, hundreds of them. Leather-bound journals sat beside field guides, topographic maps, wildlife sketches, weather records, and carefully labeled wooden boxes. Everything was organized with military precision. Nothing appeared abandoned. Dust coated the furniture, but only lightly. The mountain had protected everything from weather. Jack lowered his backpack without realizing it. His voice disappeared into the stillness. This can't be real. Atlas ignored the shelves. He wandered slowly across the room, sniffing with quiet concentration. His pace changed near the fireplace. The old shepherd stopped, sat down, then lowered himself gently onto the wooden floor. Jack followed. Above the stone mantel hung a faded military photograph inside a simple oak frame. Two younger men smiled at the camera. One was Owen, the other Jack, taken some time before either of them had gray hair. Neither looked old enough to understand how much life could change. Beside the photograph hung something even more unexpected. An old military working dog collar, weathered leather, worn brass buckle, a small engraved nameplate. Rex, Atlas stared at it without moving. Jack knelt beside him. "You found an old partner." Atlas leaned quietly against the stone hearth. For several moments, neither of them moved. Jack imagined Owen sitting here after long days in the mountains, one veteran, one loyal dog, finding peace where no one else even knew a cabin existed. He stood and continued exploring. A sturdy work table occupied the center of the room. Magnifying lenses, drawing tools, pressed wildflowers sealed beneath glass. Tiny handwritten labels, cabinets filled with carefully sorted rock samples. Rows of glass jars containing pine cones, feathers, insects, and seeds. Every object reflected patient observation. Nothing reflected wealth. This wasn't a hideout for treasure. It was the life's work of a man who had learned to pay attention. Jack opened one journal at random. The first page contained a pencil sketch of a bald eagle. The drawing looked almost photographic. Owen had written, April 14th, first nesting pair returned to the eastern cliff. Leave the area untouched until fledglings fly. Jack turned another page. Detailed notes, animal tracks, water temperatures, migration dates, plant growth, rainfall. Every season documented across decades. He slowly realized what he was holding. Owen hadn't been hiding from the world. He had been studying it. One journal became another, then another. The shelves held years of quiet work. Thousands of pages, entire ecosystems recorded by hand. Jack reached a large wall map covered with colored pins. Each pin marked a spring, a nesting site, a game trail, an avalanche zone. Everything connected, everything understood. He remembered the countless patrol maps Owen had drawn overseas, always noticing details everyone else missed. Nothing about that had changed. Atlas suddenly stood. The shepherd walked toward a small wooden desk positioned beneath a narrow window carved into the cliff. Sunlight filtered through the opening. filling the room with soft afternoon light. On the center of the desk rested a single envelope. Unlike everything else, it was perfectly clean, as though Owen had placed it there expecting someone to arrive. Jack picked it up carefully. Only 2 words appeared across the front, for Jack. His throat tightened. Atlas quietly rested beside the chair. Jack turned the envelope over. The seal remained unbroken. Outside, the waterfall continued roaring beyond the hidden walls. Inside the cabin, there was only silence, and the unmistakable feeling that Owen Mercer had been waiting years for this moment. Jack turned the envelope over in his hands before carefully breaking the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but Owen's handwriting remained as steady and deliberate as Jack remembered. He unfolded the letter. "My brother, if you're reading this, then Atlas trusted this place enough to bring you here. I always believed he would. You once dragged me out of a valley where neither of us expected to survive. I never found the right way to repay that debt, so I built something instead." Jack stopped reading. The memory came rushing back. A narrow Afghan valley, a reconnaissance patrol, an explosion that had split the silence without warning, Owen disappearing behind a cloud of dust, Jack ignoring incoming fire to reach him, the weight of another grown man across his shoulders, every step uphill feeling impossible. The helicopter lifting away while bullets struck the rocks below. He blinked hard. The cabin returned, the fireless stove, the shelves, Atlas lying quietly near the hearth. Jack looked back at the letter. "I tried going home after the army. Everyone told me time would fix things. Time didn't. The mountains did." Jack swallowed. Outside, rainwater continued striking the waterfall with a steady rhythm. "I found this canyon by accident during a search and rescue exercise years ago. Behind the water, I found silence unlike anything I'd known since we came home. So I stayed. Not because I wanted to hide from people, because I needed somewhere my mind finally stopped expecting the next explosion." Jack slowly lowered himself into the wooden chair. The words felt less like a letter, more like someone describing his own life. His fingers tightened around the paper. "I know what nights are like, the dreams, the noise, the guilt that never seems to belong to one memory alone. If yours became anything like mine, then one day you would need this place more than I ever did." Atlas rose from beside the fireplace and crossed the room without making a sound. The old shepherd rested his head gently across Jack's bruised leg. Jack instinctively placed one hand on the dog's neck. His fingers found the familiar scars hidden beneath thick fur, scars from another lifetime, another country, another war. He continued reading. "People will tell you this land is worthless. Let them. The moment people discover value, they begin trying to own it. The mountain has survived because everyone believed it offered nothing." Jack glanced around the room again. He finally understood. The waterfall wasn't hiding the cabin. It was protecting it. The letter continued. "I didn't build this refuge because I was afraid. I built it because I finally learned that surviving and living are not the same thing." Jack closed his eyes. Those words settled somewhere deep inside him. For nearly a year he had been surviving, sleeping in his truck, counting dollars, avoiding crowds, waiting for another day to end. But living. He wasn't sure he'd done much of that since leaving the army. Atlas nudged him gently. Jack smiled faintly. "I hear you." The dog answered with a slow thump of his tail against the wooden floor. At the bottom of the first page, Owen had written one final sentence. "There's one more thing you need to know." Jack unfolded the second page. It contained no maps, no instructions, only a single paragraph. "If you ever wonder why I chose you, remember that in the valley, everyone else saw gunfire. You noticed I was still breathing. Most people look. Very few actually observe. That's why this place belongs to you." Jack lowered the letter. His eyes drifted toward the shelves covering the walls, every journal, every drawing, every carefully labeled specimen, everything Owen had spent decades protecting. None of it had been created to impress anyone. It had simply been preserved for the person who would understand why it mattered. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the canyon. The sound entered through the hidden window. Jack stiffened. For an instant, his heartbeat accelerated. Another flash, another rumble. His breathing shortened. He could almost smell diesel fuel, feel the dry heat of Afghanistan pressing against his face. His hand reached automatically toward the empty space beside the chair where a rifle would once have rested. Nothing, only air. Atlas stood immediately. Without hesitation, he climbed halfway onto the chair and leaned his full weight against Jack's shoulder. Solid, steady, present. Jack focused on the warmth beneath his hand, the rough grain of the wooden armrest, the scent of cedar, the quiet crackle of kindling as he finally lit the old stove with dry firewood stacked beside it. Small flames flickered to life. The cabin slowly filled with warmth. The thunder outside became distant once again. Jack leaned back. For the first time in longer than he could remember, there were no passing headlights, no parking lot noises, no strangers walking past his truck. Only the soft glow of firelight reflecting across Owen's journals. Atlas curled beside the stove with a long, contented sigh. Jack folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside its envelope. Then he looked around the hidden cabin one more time. This wasn't an inheritance, he whispered. It was a rescue. That night, wrapped beneath one of Owen's heavy wool blankets, Jack listened to the waterfall beyond the stone walls. The sound was still powerful, still constant, but it no longer resembled helicopters or incoming fire. It sounded like rain falling where it belonged. When morning sunlight finally slipped through the narrow window, Jack opened his eyes. For the first time in years, he realized he had slept through the entire night without waking once. Jack remained on the cot for another minute, almost afraid to move. Morning light filtered through the narrow window carved into the mountainside, laying pale ribbons across Owen's desk. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar, old paper, and fresh coffee brewing on the cast-iron stove. Atlas stretched beside the fireplace, his joints cracking softly before he walked over and rested his head against Jack's hand. "Morning," the shepherd answered with a slow wag of his tail. Outside, the waterfall continued its endless conversation with the canyon. Only now, Jack noticed something strange. The sound no longer tightened the muscles in his shoulders. It simply existed. After breakfast, he began exploring the cabin more carefully. Every shelf revealed another surprise. Detailed weather journals dating back almost 30 years, sketches of elk migrations, handwritten maps showing forgotten springs and abandoned logging trails, neatly labeled drawers filled with polished arrowheads, feathers, and pressed mountain flowers. Nothing had been collected for profit. Everything had been preserved, because Owen believed it mattered. Jack gently dusted one of the shelves. "I get it now." Atlas watched quietly from the doorway. By afternoon, Jack carried several journals outside to the overlook, where sunlight made the faded ink easier to read. Hours slipped by unnoticed. He found himself reading the way he had once studied reconnaissance reports. Patiently, look for patterns. Every page revealed another piece of the mountain story. He never heard the voices until Atlas did. The shepherd lifted his head sharply. His ears turned toward the trail. 3 short barks echoed through the trees. Jack closed the journal. Someone was coming. 2 hikers appeared first. A middle-aged couple wearing bright rain jackets climbed the rocky trail carrying daypacks far too small for overnight travel. The woman looked exhausted. "We're sorry," she called. "We lost the marked trail." Jack stood. "It happens. The bridge washed out downstream," the man explained. "We've been circling for hours." Atlas walked toward them with calm confidence, sniffed each backpack, then quietly returned to Jack's side, satisfied. Jack pointed toward a safer route along the ridge. "If you follow that trail, you'll reach the county road before dark." The woman looked toward the waterfall. "Beautiful place," Jack nodded. It is. Neither hiker noticed the hidden passage behind the falling water. Within minutes, they disappeared into the trees. Jack thought little more about it until 3 days later. A white pickup truck stopped beside the old logging gate, then another. By the time Jack reached the overlook, 4 men were unloading surveying equipment, tripods, GPS receivers, range poles. Atlas immediately stepped in front of Jack. The fur along his back lifted slightly, not aggression. Warning! Victor Hale climbed out of the second truck wearing the same polished boots Jack remembered from the courthouse. Mr. Sullivan, Jack said nothing. Victor smiled politely. I hope you're settling in. I was. Victor ignored the reply. My survey crew is simply confirming neighboring property boundaries. Jack glanced towards the equipment. They're a long way from your property. Victor removed a folded map. Actually, that's what we're determining. He pointed toward the waterfall. There's reason to believe the old county survey placed this boundary incorrectly. Jack accepted the map without comment. He studied it, then quietly compared it with Owen's original survey folded inside his own notebook. The difference appeared almost immediately. Victor's copy showed the northern boundary shifted nearly 60 feet, enough to place the hidden cabin outside Jack's property. Jack looked up. Interesting. Victor smiled. You noticed something? The contour lines? What about them? They don't match the terrain. Victor's smile faded just enough for Jack to notice. Our engineers are confident. I'm sure they are. Jack handed the map back. No argument, no raised voice, just observation. The survey crew spread out across the canyon. Jack watched silently. Reconnaissance before action, always. One worker drove a fresh wooden stake into the ground. Another marked coordinates on a handheld receiver. Something felt wrong. Atlas noticed it first. The shepherd walked toward a cluster of moss-covered rocks near the northern ledge. He lowered his nose, sniffed carefully, then began growling, low, steady. Jack crossed the clearing. What is it? Atlas pawed gently at disturbed soil beside one of the rocks. Fresh dirt, still loose. Jack crouched. The ground had clearly been dug up within the last day or two. Nearby lay fragments of old wood, not naturally exposed. Moved, his eyes shifted uphill. One of the original iron pitons he had discovered days earlier was gone. Someone had removed it, deliberately. Jack straightened without saying a word. Instead of confronting Victor, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. No signal, but the camera still worked. He photographed everything. Fresh soil, missing piton, survey stakes, boot prints, every angle, every detail. Victor walked over. Find something? Jack slipped the phone back into his jacket. Maybe, Victor laughed lightly. I admire persistence. Jack met his eyes. I admire accuracy. For a moment, neither man spoke. Only the waterfall filled the silence. Victor finally adjusted his gloves. Once the survey is complete, we'll know exactly who owns what. Jack glanced toward Atlas. The shepherd still stared at the disturbed ground. He hadn't relaxed, not once. Jack trusted that instinct more than any survey. As the trucks disappeared down the logging road that evening, Atlas remained beside the northern ledge. The old dog sniffed the air again, then looked toward the steep slope above the waterfall. Jack followed his gaze. Fresh boot prints climbed into the trees, not toward the road, toward the cliffs overlooking the hidden passage. Someone hadn't simply come to measure the land. Someone had been searching for something. And now Jack suspected they might already know there was far more hidden behind the waterfall than anyone was supposed to find. He waited until the sound of Victor Hale's trucks disappeared into the distance before climbing the slope where Atlas had found the fresh tracks. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the forest floor, making every footprint easier to see. Jack crouched beside the first print. Deep tread, expensive hiking boot, nearly new. He measured the length against his hand. Size 11, probably 190 pounds, walking uphill, not running. He photographed it before moving on. Atlas stayed several yards ahead, carefully following the scent without disturbing the ground. Jack smiled quietly. You would have made one hell of a reconnaissance scout. Atlas flicked an ear, but never broke concentration. The tracks led toward a rocky overlook above the waterfall. From there, Jack immediately understood why someone had come. The hidden entrance couldn't be seen, but the ledge behind the falls, under the right lighting. A careful observer might notice the unusual shadow where the water briefly separated from the cliff. Barely, only for a moment. Only if someone knew exactly where to look. Jack's stomach tightened. Victor wasn't guessing anymore. He was getting closer. Jack returned to the cabin before dusk. Inside, he opened Owen's journals again. This time he searched for references to visitors rather than wildlife. Several entries caught his attention. June 18th, footprints near the North Ridge, not hikers. Watching. August 4th, someone removed one climbing marker, replaced before winter. September 12th, if they ever begin searching seriously, the journals must remain here. Jack leaned back slowly. This wasn't new. Owen had known someone was interested in the canyon years before. Another journal contained a folded, hand-drawn map. Several locations had been circled in red pencil. One notation stood out, observation points. Never approach directly. Always assume someone else is watching. Jack almost laughed. Even in retirement, Owen had still thought like a Special Forces scout. Atlas suddenly lifted his head, not barking, listening. Jack heard it a second later. A faint metallic sound. Clink, then silence. Outside, near the upper ridge. Jack extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness filled the cabin. He waited. No movement, no voices. Only the distant waterfall. Lost stood beside the hidden door, completely motionless. Jack whispered, "Stay." The shepherd remained exactly where he was. Jack moved to the narrow observation window overlooking the canyon. He waited nearly 10 minutes before the moon finally emerged from behind drifting clouds. Silver light washed across the cliffs. Then, movement, a flashlight. Brief, gone almost instantly. Someone had shielded it with a hand. Professional, not careless campers. Jack watched patiently. Another flash. Higher on the ridge, studying the waterfall, not hiking, observing. He never reached for a weapon. Instead, he reached for his notebook. Time. Direction, estimated distance, weather, moon position. Everything Owen had taught him years ago. Never trust adrenaline. Trust information. The light disappeared. A full hour passed before Jack relaxed. Whoever had been there never approached the hidden entrance. Perhaps they hadn't found it, yet. The next morning dawned bright and unusually warm. Jack hiked into the nearby valley to visit Ruth Parker. She welcomed him onto her porch with fresh coffee already waiting. "You look tired." "I had company." Her expression changed. "Victor, maybe." Jack described the flashlight on the ridge, the missing piton, the disturbed soil. Ruth listened without interrupting. Finally, she sighed. "I hoped they'd stopped looking. They've been here before." She nodded slowly. "Years ago." Jack leaned forward. "You knew." "I suspected." She looked toward the mountains. About 15 years back, survey crews came through, asking strange questions. What kind? They weren't interested in timber or water rights. They kept asking whether Owen had built anything. Jack felt a chill despite the warm morning. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. He built birdhouses." She smiled faintly. "And fences." They left disappointed. Jack looked down at his coffee. "So Victor's not the first." Nota. Ruth's face grew serious. "But he's the first one with enough money to keep trying." Jack thanked her before hiking back toward the canyon. Halfway home, Atlas suddenly froze. The shepherd stood perfectly still, staring uphill. Jack followed his gaze. A section of loose shale rested above the trail, freshly disturbed, too fresh. Tiny stones continued rolling downhill. Someone had been there recently, Jack stepped backward instinctively. Easy! A loud crack echoed overhead. The hillside shifted. Hundreds of pounds of loose rock broke free at once. Move! Jack lunged toward the trees. Atlas sprang beside him. Stone crashed against stone as the slope exploded into motion. Boulders bounced across the trail. Branches snapped like dry matchsticks. Jack shoved Atlas toward a large cedar just as another rock struck his shoulder, spinning him sideways. Pain shot down his arm. He stumbled. Another boulder slammed into the ground only feet away. The earth trembled. Dust filled the air. When the noise finally stopped, silence returned almost as suddenly as it had vanished. Jack pushed himself upright. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow. Atlas? No answer. His heart lurched. He stumbled through the dust. Atlas! A soft whine answered from beneath a fallen pine. Jack dropped to one knee. The old shepherd was pinned by a thick branch across his hindquarters. His front paws clawed weakly at the ground. But he never stopped trying to reach Jack. It's okay. Jack's voice remained steady, despite the panic rising inside him. I've got you. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, Jack lifted the branch just enough to pull Atlas free. The shepherd immediately tried to stand. His back leg buckled beneath him. Jack caught him before he fell. Atlas leaned heavily against his chest. Jack gently examined the injured leg. No obvious break, but swelling had already begun around the hip. We're getting you help. Atlas licked Jack's hand once, even injured. He was trying to comfort the man who was carrying him. Jack looked uphill toward the broken slope. The rocks had fallen naturally, or so it appeared. Yet high above the slide, barely visible between two trees, he spotted a single fresh boot print in the soft earth. Someone had been standing there, watching. Just before the mountain came down, Jack fixed the image in his memory. The boot print rested in a patch of soft earth, untouched by the rock slide. Whoever had stood there had chosen the only stable section of the slope. That wasn't luck, that was planning. He looked down at Atlas. The old shepherd leaned heavily against him, refusing to whine despite the obvious pain. Jack slipped one arm beneath Atlas's chest and another beneath his hindquarters. You carried me once. He managed a tired smile. My turn. Atlas rested his head against Jack's shoulder. The hike back to the truck took nearly 2 hours. Jack ignored the throbbing in his bruised ribs and the blood drying across his forehead. Every few minutes, he stopped to let Atlas rest, checking the dog's breathing, and gently feeling the swollen leg. Combat lifesaver training never truly left him. Observe, assess, treat, reassure. By the time they reached the county road, evening shadows stretched across the valley. The nearest veterinarian was a small clinic outside Ashford. Dr. Emily Carter met them at the door before Jack even finished carrying Atlas inside. What happened? Rockslide. Immediately guided them into an examination room. Atlas never resisted. He simply watched Jack. Dr. Carter examined the injured leg with practiced hands. After several x-rays, she returned, carrying a relieved smile. No fractures. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Just severe bruising and strained muscles. She gently stroked Atlas's ears. For a dog his age, that's remarkably good news. Jack laughed quietly. He's always been stubborn. So have you, judging by your shoulder. Only then did Jack notice how stiff his own arm had become. Within minutes, his cuts were cleaned, his shoulder wrapped, and Atlas received medication for pain and inflammation. Jack settled the old shepherd into the truck. Dr. Carter handed him a small paper bag. Easy walks for a while. Atlas looked offended. Jack chuckled. That's going to be the difficult part. The drive back through the mountains was slow. Atlas slept most of the way with his head resting across the passenger seat. Jack glanced at him every few minutes, not because he expected something to be wrong, because he was grateful the dog was still there. The hidden cabin felt different that night. Not mysterious, protective. Jack lit the stove and spread extra blankets beside it, before helping Atlas settle near the warmth. The old shepherd sighed deeply. Within minutes, he was asleep. Jack sat at Owen's desk long after darkness settled outside. He unfolded another journal. This one was different. Instead of wildlife observations, it contained copies of legal records, survey notes, and carefully organized correspondence dating back nearly 25 years. Jack frowned. The first document described an abandoned mining proposal, rejected. The second involved a hydroelectric feasibility study, withdrawn. Then came a series of letters between Owen and a state environmental scientist. Each page revealed another piece of the puzzle. Callahan Falls wasn't valuable because of gold, or timber, or hidden minerals. The canyon contained one of the last untouched cold water ecosystems in the region. Rare trout spawned there. Ancient cedar groves sheltered endangered owls. Plants thought extinct elsewhere still grew along the mist-covered cliffs. Owen had documented every species, every season, every nesting cycle. His journals weren't simply personal notes. They were scientific evidence. Jack turned another page. A handwritten entry stopped him cold. If these records disappear, the developers will argue no protected habitat exists. The mountain cannot speak for itself, so I will. Jack slowly leaned back. Victor Hale hadn't inherited a dispute over worthless land. He had inherited a problem. As long as Owen's records existed, large-scale development would face enormous legal obstacles. Jack opened another box beneath the desk. Inside rested dozens of neatly labeled rolls of photographic film, along with waterproof cases containing memory cards from newer digital cameras, thousands of photographs, every one cataloged, every one dated. Atlas stirred quietly beside the stove. Jack looked over. "You knew, didn't you?" The shepherd opened one eye before closing it again, almost as if the answer required no words. Near the bottom of the box lay one final envelope, addressed in Owen's handwriting. Not for Jack, for any attorney protecting Callahan Falls. Jack carefully unfolded the documents inside. Environmental reports, property surveys, affidavits, signed statements from biologists. Everything required to establish decades of continuous conservation records. Owen hadn't merely hidden a cabin. He had preserved enough evidence to defend an entire wilderness. Jack suddenly remembered Margaret Ellis. She had looked genuinely surprised when Victor questioned the property boundaries. Maybe she hadn't known any of this existed. Now she needed to. The following morning, Jack packed copies of the most important documents into a waterproof folder. The originals remained safely inside the cabin. He refused to risk losing them. Before leaving, he knelt beside Atlas. "You stay here." The old shepherd immediately struggled to stand. His injured leg trembled beneath him. Jack gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Negative." Atlas sighed dramatically before settling back onto the blanket. Jack smiled. "That's an order." For the first time since the injury, the shepherd's tail gave a slow, reluctant wag. Jack stepped outside into the cool mountain air. Mist drifted above the waterfall exactly as it had every morning before. Nothing about the canyon appeared extraordinary. Yet hidden behind the falling water rested enough truth to change everything Victor Hale believed he could take. Jack looked once toward the ridge where the rock slide had begun. The boot prints were gone. Rain during the night had washed them away, but memories didn't disappear as easily. Someone had tried to frighten him away. Instead, they had given him one more reason to stay. Jack locked the hidden cabin before hiking toward Ashford with Owen's waterproof folder secured inside his backpack. Atlas watched from the cabin doorway. His injured leg still carried most of his weight awkwardly, but his eyes followed Jack until the trees swallowed him from sight. "I'll be back before dark," the shepherd answered with a quiet bark. Margaret Ellis looked surprised when Jack entered her office carrying a weathered folder instead of another question. "You found something." Jack placed the folder gently on her desk. "I found what Owen spent 30 years protecting." Margaret opened the first document, then another. Her expression changed with every page. By the time she reached the environmental surveys, she removed her glasses and leaned back. My goodness, she carefully spread several maps across her desk. I've never seen these. Owen kept everything. He certainly did. She turned another page. The state biologists signed these reports, their original copies. Margaret nodded slowly. That explains why Victor has been so aggressive. Jack folded his arms. You knew he wanted the waterfall. I knew he wanted land. She looked directly at him. I didn't realize he wanted this land. She reached for her phone. I need to make several calls. Within an hour, the office filled with quiet activity. Certified copies were scanned. Digital backups created. Chain of custody records completed. Margaret handled every page with the care normally reserved for historical archives. When she finally looked up, her voice carried quiet confidence. If these records are authentic, and I believe they are, they establish decades of documented habitat preservation. What does that mean? It means any major commercial development will face enormous legal barriers, Jack nodded. Owen figured that. Margaret smiled faintly. He figured a great many things. As Jack stepped outside, a familiar black SUV rolled into the courthouse parking lot. Victor Hale climbed out. Their eyes met across the pavement. Victor smiled politely. Mr. Sullivan, Jack waited. I heard you've been spending quite a bit of time exploring? I have. Victor adjusted his jacket. I'd still like to purchase your property. It isn't for sale. I can improve my offer. Victor stepped closer. Perhaps you don't understand its value. Jack held his gaze. I think I understand it better than you do. For the first time, Victor's smile disappeared completely. What exactly does that mean? Jack answered honestly. It means you've been measuring the wrong thing. Without another word, he walked to his truck. Victor remained standing in the parking lot, watching him leave. The next week brought unexpected visitors, not developers, biologists, forest ecologists, a fisheries specialist, 2 state conservation officers. Margaret had arranged for every agency connected to Owen's records to verify the evidence firsthand. Jack led them carefully through the hidden passage behind the waterfall. Each person entered the cabin in complete silence. One elderly biologist stopped beside the shelves of journals. He gently opened a notebook before looking at Jack with unmistakable emotion. Do you realize what this is? Owen's work. It's far more than that. He carefully turned another page. This is one of the most complete long-term ecosystem records I've ever seen. Another scientist examined the photographs. Incredible. They documented owl nesting sites before anyone officially knew they existed. They even recorded stream temperatures. A fisheries expert shook his head in disbelief. These records cover nearly 3 decades. Jack watched them move through the room. No one admired expensive furniture. No one asked about hidden treasure. Every person understood exactly what Owen had left behind. Atlas limped quietly from visitor to visitor, accepting gentle scratches behind the ears before returning to lie beside the fireplace. The old shepherd seemed content, as though strangers had finally arrived for the right reasons. 3 days later, the county commissioners announced a public hearing regarding future development proposals around Callahan Falls. The meeting hall overflowed. Residents filled every chair. Victor Hale arrived with engineers, consultants, and lawyers. Jack arrived with Margaret. Atlas rested quietly beside his chair wearing an old service dog vest Jack had kept since retirement. Margaret spoke first. She introduced Owen's journals, scientific records, historical surveys, wildlife documentation. Then one by one, the visiting experts explained what the evidence meant. The canyon supported protected habitat. The waterfall fed one of the region's healthiest cold water systems. Several rare species depended entirely upon the untouched cliffs. Every statement rested upon Owen's meticulous observations. Victor eventually stood. My company respects conservation. His polished voice echoed confidently through the room. We simply believe responsible development can benefit everyone. A commissioner looked toward the stack of journals. Can your proposal preserve everything documented here? Victor hesitated. No development preserves everything. The room grew noticeably quieter. An older rancher slowly stood from the audience. Jack recognized Earl Dawson, the same man who had once laughed about inheriting a useless waterfall. Earl removed his hat. I've lived here 68 years. He looked around the room. We always figured Owen was just an old man wandering the woods. He nodded toward Jack. Turns out he was watching over all of us. Several others quietly applauded. Then another voice joined. Then another. The applause spread through the hall. Not loud, respectful, sincere. Jack glanced down at Atlas. The old shepherd leaned gently against his leg. Neither of them had come looking for recognition. Only truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Victor. Across the street, Jack slipped quietly toward his truck. He preferred leaving before anyone noticed. As he opened the driver's door, Margaret caught up with him. The commissioners haven't voted yet. Jack nodded. I know, but after today, she smiled. I think Owen would finally be at peace. Jack looked toward the distant mountains rising beyond town. So would I, far above the valley, hidden behind the waterfall. The cabin waited exactly where Owen had left it. Not as a secret anymore, but as a promise that some things become most valuable only after someone chooses not to sell them. 3 weeks later, the commissioners gathered once more inside the county meeting hall. This time the room was quieter. There were no raised voices, no stacks of competing maps. Only one question remained. Would Callahan Falls remain protected? Jack sat near the back beside Atlas. The old shepherd's injured leg had healed enough for him to walk without pain, though a slight stiffness remained after long hikes. Jack smiled every time he noticed it. Age had earned them both a slower pace. The chairman adjusted his microphone. After reviewing the scientific documentation, property records, environmental studies, and public testimony, he paused. The board unanimously designates the Callahan Falls watershed as a protected conservation area. Applause filled the room, longer this time. Warmer, Victor Hale never stood. He quietly gathered his briefcase before leaving through the side door without speaking to anyone. Jack watched him go. There was no satisfaction in seeing another man lose. Only relief that the mountain had won. Outside, reporters searched for interviews. Jack slipped away before they noticed him. He had never been comfortable with attention. Atlas walked beside him, brushing lightly against his leg as they crossed the parking lot. Let's go home. The drive back felt different. Not because the road had changed, because Jack finally knew where it ended. When they reached the waterfall, evening sunlight turned the mist into a curtain of gold. Jack stood for a long moment before stepping behind the familiar cascade. The hidden passage welcomed them with its cool silence. The cabin waited exactly as Owen had left it. But now it no longer felt borrowed. It felt entrusted. Over the following months, Jack worked carefully. Nothing happened quickly. That was exactly how he wanted it. He repaired loose roof beams using fallen cedar instead of cutting healthy trees. He cleaned every journal before placing them inside climate-controlled storage cabinets donated by the County Historical Society. Margaret helped arrange legal protections so Owen's research would remain available to universities while the originals never left the cabin. Ruth Parker visited every Sunday carrying fresh bread and stories Owen had never written down. Atlas supervised every project from the porch. At least that was what Jack claimed. The old shepherd preferred lying in the sunshine while pretending not to watch every nail Jack hammered. Word slowly spread, not about hidden treasure, about something better. Veterans began arriving quietly. One man struggling after losing his wife. Another who hadn't slept through the night in years. A retired medic who admitted he hadn't spoken about the war since coming home. Jack never advertised. He never charged anyone. If someone needed a few quiet days, there was always another blanket, another cup of coffee, another chair beside the stove. The cabin became exactly what Owen had hoped it would become, a place where silence healed instead of haunted. One rainy afternoon, Jack found himself sitting at Owen's desk, writing in a fresh journal. Not about battles, not about nightmares. He wrote about the first pair of eagles returning that spring, about Atlas chasing butterflies he never intended to catch, about wildflowers blooming earlier than last year. He smiled. Without realizing it, he had begun observing instead of merely surviving. One autumn evening, nearly a year after arriving, Jack carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the porch, hidden behind the waterfall. Mist drifted across the canyon while maple trees below glowed red and gold beneath the setting sun. Atlas settled beside him with a satisfied sigh. His muzzle had grown almost completely white. Jack scratched gently behind his ears. "You picked the right place." Atlas rested his head across Jack's boot. Far below, someone called from the trail. Jack stood. An older pickup had stopped near the old logging gate. A man climbed out slowly, carrying a worn duffel bag. His shoulders were straight, but his eyes carried the familiar weight Jack had once seen every morning in his own reflection. The stranger hesitated when he reached the overlook. "I was told," he stopped awkwardly. "I was told a veteran lived up here." Jack walked down the trail to meet him. "I do." The man looked embarrassed. "I don't really know why I came." Jack nodded gently. "You don't have to." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The waterfall filled the silence between them. Finally, Jack smiled. "Coffee's hot." The stranger managed the smallest smile in return. "I'd like that." Atlas rose slowly and walked to the newcomer. He sniffed the man's hand once before gently leaning against his leg. The stranger's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Jack watched the moment quietly. Years earlier, Atlas had done exactly the same thing for him. Some things never changed. The 3 of them disappeared together behind the waterfall. The hidden passage remained invisible from the outside. Only the mountain knew they were there. Inside the cabin, the fire already burned warmly. Owen's journals rested safely upon their shelves. The kettle began to whistle. Outside, the waterfall continued flowing exactly as it always had. Patient, steady, endless. Jack finally understood why Owen had chosen this place over every other place on Earth. The greatest inheritance had never been the land. It had been the chance to help the next person find the way home. If this story meant something to you, leave a simple 1 in the comments. It may only be one number, but it lets me know this journey reached your heart. And if you've ever believed that loyalty, courage, and kindness still matter, leave a 0 instead. I'd love to see how many of us are still here. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story is already waiting, and I can't wait to share it with you. Until next time, take care of yourself, and never underestimate where one faithful friend can lead you.